There's a folder on my desktop I haven't opened in like 14 months. It's a half-finished novel, 72 pages long, which stopped mid-scene in a coffee shop on a very frustrating Sunday afternoon when I got up to refill my drink and simply never sat back down. The document still has the cursor blinking in my mind. I can feel it. I haven't forgotten about it, not even close. It's just that every time I come close to clicking on that folder, something tightens in my chest, something that feels less like procrastination and more like the feeling you get standing outside a hospital room, hand on the door. It feels like grief almost. And that's what I want to talk about. We have an entire cultural vocabulary for finished things. We celebrate the launch, the release, the publication. We eulogize things we lost before they had a chance to begin. The pregnancy that didn't take, the business idea that got killed by circumstance, the relationship that never got off the ground. But the unfinished project exists in a strange in-between space. It isn't gone, it isn't here, it's in a folder on your desktop or a box in your closet or a voice memo you recorded at 2 a.m. that you've never transcribed. It's technically alive, which means you're not allowed to mourn it. Except you are. You just don't know that yet. Before we move forward, please like, subscribe, join, and donate. It really helps. Here's what nobody tells you about the creative self. It doesn't organize projects, it extends itself into them. When you start something, really start it. Not just flirt with the idea of it. You pour a version of yourself into that work. Your best thinking, your most specific imagination, the particular way you see the world at 11 p.m. when everyone else is asleep and you finally have silence enough to hear yourself think. That project isn't just a file or a canvas or a half-knitted sleeve. It's a container for a you that existed at a very specific moment in time. When the project goes unfinished, you don't just leave the work behind. You leave that version of yourself behind. This is why old projects feel so strange to return to. It isn't just that the work is incomplete. It's that the person who started it is, in some important sense, gone. The you who had that particular fever for that particular idea, who read that book that gave you the concept, who had that conversation that cracked the whole thing open, who was living in that apartment or going through that season of your life, that person has moved on. You open the file and feel like you're reading someone else's diary. Because, in a way, you are. And here's where the grief gets layered. You're mourning the project and the self who started it and the future you imagined when you began. That future where the thing got done, where it existed in the world, where other people held it and were changed by it. You grieve the alternate timeline, and alternate timelines are arguably the most untreatable form of loss because they can never be definitively disproven. There's a particular kind of shame that attaches itself to unfinished creative work that doesn't attach to other kinds of failure. If you started training for a marathon and stopped at mile 4, people shrug. Life happens. But if you told everyone you were writing a novel and 2 years later no one has read it, that silence becomes its own accusation. You hear it in the way people ask, so whatever happened with that thing you were working on? Not unkindly, just with a slight upward tilt at the end that carries all the weight of expectation you yourself had once placed on it. So you learn to not talk about what you're making until it's done. And then you learn to not start things because not starting feels safer than the particular shame of stopping. And then one day you realize you haven't made anything in years and you don't entirely know who you are anymore. And you think it's a discipline problem or a motivation problem or a fear of success problem, when actually it's a grief problem. You've been avoiding the grief of every half-made thing. And in doing so, you've been avoiding making. This is how people become people who used to be creative. What makes it worse is that unfinished creative work doesn't decay the way other abandoned things do. A missed gym phase fades from memory. A hobby you dropped stops mattering. But a creative project, especially one that came from somewhere real, stays vivid. It remembers you even when you're trying to forget it. An image from the unfinished painting will surface while you're washing dishes. A line from the half-written song will come back at 3 a.m. with the specific cruelty of a dream. You'll meet someone who reminds you of a character you invented and never got to finish writing. And you'll feel a brief, strange ache you can't quite explain. This is because the project was made of attention, and attention is intimate. It leaves a residue. The ideas you spend time with become part of your inner landscape, whether you like it or not. And so you walk around carrying these quiet, invisible monuments. The album that never got tracked, the manuscript that stopped at chapter 4, the Etsy shop you built and then quietly took down. Each one a small room inside you, furnished and lit, with the door slightly ajar. The question is not whether to open the door. The question is whether you can stand in the hallway without shame. The question we're sitting with is not why didn't you finish it? You know why. Because life has centrifugal force, and the unfinished project has no deadline and no one waiting for it except the version of you who started it. And that version has grown quiet. The question is, what are you going to do with the grief? And the first thing, the most important thing, is to actually let yourself feel it as grief, not as failure, not as evidence of your fundamental flakiness or your inability to commit or your deep incompatibility with the life of a maker, as grief, which means it follows the rules of grief. It needs to be witnessed, it needs to be named, and it needs to be given some kind of ceremony, even a small one. Some people go back. They finish the thing, not because the original fever returns, but because they decide the work deserves an ending regardless. They finish it for their earlier self as an act of love or acknowledgement. There is something genuinely sacred about this. It is the creative equivalent of tending a grave. Some people decide to close the file for good, to look the project in the eye and say, this one is done, not because it's finished, but because I'm releasing it. This is harder than it sounds. It requires you to believe that allowing something to be unfinished is not the same as failing, that not every project is meant to be completed, that some things exist only to move you from where you were to where you needed to be, to teach you the thing, to build the muscle, to open the door. And that's enough. The unfinished project was not a mistake. It was a transit. And some people learn to live alongside the unfinished thing, neither returning to it nor releasing it, but making peace with its presence. The folder on the desktop becomes less a wound and more a monument. A record of a version of yourself who had an idea and loved it and started it, and that was real, and that was enough, even if the world never saw it. There's a word in Japanese, mono no aware. Loosely, it translates to the pathos of things, a kind of tender, melancholy recognition of the transient nature of beautiful things. Cherry blossoms are the classic image, but I think unfinished creative work belongs in that same register. There is something beautiful in the half-made thing if you can bear to look at it without flinching. Proof that you had the impulse, that you answered it, that for a period of time you were so alive to an idea that you spent some of your one irreplaceable life trying to make it real. That deserves something more than shame. The folder on my desktop is still there. I haven't opened it, but I've stopped pretending it doesn't exist, which turns out to be its own kind of progress. I look at it sometimes and I think there's a version of me in there mid-sentence who believed completely in what he was making. I'm not ready to go back in yet, but I'm glad I tried.